August 14th, 1945. Somewhere in rural Texas, the flatbed truck rattled to a stop on a dirt road flanked by endless sky and dry wind. The young Japanese nurse felt her heart hammer against her ribs as a man in a dusty cowboy hat stepped forward, tipped his brim, and spoke words she barely understood. "She sleeps in my bed." Her breath caught. Every warning, every whispered fear from the camps rushed back at once. She braced for what came next. But what followed wasn't cruelty. It wasn't mockery. It was something far more confusing, something that would shatter everything she'd been taught about the enemy. If this story challenges everything you thought you knew about wartime captivity, hit that like button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Whether you're tuning in from Tokyo, Texas, or Toronto, we read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because stories like this don't get told often enough, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The woman standing on that porch wasn't a soldier. She was a nurse, barely 21, who had survived jungle warfare, bombings, starvation, and capture. She had watched comrades die from infected wounds because there were no bandages, no medicine, no hope. She had been told by her own officers that surrender meant dishonor worse than death. And she had been warned explicitly, repeatedly, that American soldiers would brutalize her, break her, strip her of dignity. Now she stood face to face with a man offering her his bed. And in that moment, the war stopped being about nations. It became about something far more dangerous, the possibility that everything she believed might be wrong. The program was never supposed to be kind. It was a wartime labor initiative, part of the broader prisoner of war system managed by the U.S. War Department under the Geneva Conventions. By mid-1945, the United States held over 400,000 Axis POWs on American soil, Germans, Italians, and a much smaller number of Japanese prisoners. Most were housed in camps across the rural South and Midwest, where labor shortages had crippled agriculture. The war had drained American farms of young men. Cotton fields, cattle ranches, and processing plants were desperate for workers. The solution was pragmatic, not humanitarian: put prisoners to work. But Japanese prisoners were different. There were fewer of them, only around 5,000 by war's end, compared to over 370,000 Germans. Japanese military culture emphasized death over surrender. Capture was seen as the ultimate shame, a betrayal of the emperor and the nation. Many Japanese soldiers chose suicide rather than fall into enemy hands. Those who were captured often arrived traumatized, malnourished, and psychologically shattered. Among them were women, nurses, laborers, and support personnel captured in the Pacific Theater. They were the rarest category of all, and they were sent to places like rural Texas, where ranchers and farmers were told only that they were getting workers. The nurse had been captured on Saipan in July 1944 during one of the bloodiest campaigns of the Pacific War. Over 30,000 Japanese soldiers died in that battle. Thousands of civilians threw themselves from cliffs rather than surrender to American forces. She had watched it happen, mothers clutching children as they jumped, men charging unarmed into machine gun fire, screaming final prayers. She had been found hiding in a cave, barely conscious, her feet torn and bleeding. An American medic had bandaged her wounds. She remembered his face, young, sunburned, exhausted. He hadn't hurt her. That confused her more than anything. For months, she lived in a detention facility on the West Coast, a converted warehouse where captured Japanese personnel were processed. The conditions weren't brutal, but they were cold, sterile. The guards rarely spoke to them. The prisoners spoke even less to each other. Shame hung over every conversation. To be alive meant you had failed. To be captured meant you were no longer Japanese. When the transfer orders came through in August 1945, she didn't know where she was going. She only knew it wasn't home. The truck ride lasted 2 days. She watched the landscape change from coastal mountains to desert plains to endless fields of dry grass. The other women with her, 15 in total, sat in silence, gripping the edges of the truck bed as it bounced over unmarked roads. They passed through small towns where children waved from porches and dogs chased the tires. Nobody shouted. Nobody threw stones. It was unsettling. Where was the hatred they had been promised? When the truck finally stopped, the nurse stepped down onto red clay soil that clung to her worn shoes. In front of her stood a ranch house with a sagging porch, a rusted wind vane, and a single rocking chair that creaked in the breeze. Beyond it stretched fields of cotton, barns painted red with peeling letters, and fences that ran toward the horizon. A man in a cowboy hat approached. He was older, maybe 50, with weathered skin and calloused hands. He didn't smile, but he nodded. Then he pointed toward the house and said the words that stopped her heart. "She sleeps in my bed." She froze. The other women behind her whispered frantically. This was it. This was the moment they had feared. But the man raised his palms slowly, gesturing for calm. He pointed to himself, then to the floor. "I sleep floor, you bed." The words were broken, but the meaning was clear. He wasn't claiming the bed with her. He was giving it to her, completely. That first night, she lay beneath a handmade quilt in a room that smelled of cedar and old books. The bed was soft, so soft it frightened her. She hadn't slept on anything but dirt, wooden boards, or thin mats in over a year. Her body didn't know how to relax. Her hands gripped the blanket edge like a lifeline. She could hear the man moving in another part of the house. He didn't come near the door. He didn't speak. He just existed, quietly, like a presence that refused to threaten her. She wept that night, not from fear, but from the dissonance of it all. She had been taught that the enemy would rape, torture, and humiliate her. Instead, he had handed her the softest thing she'd touched in years and laid himself on the floor. The kindness was unbearable. It didn't fit. It broke the story she had carried since childhood, the story that had kept her alive through bombings and starvation and the cave on Saipan. If the enemy could be kind, then what did that make her? What did it make the men who had told her to die rather than surrender? Morning came with the smell of bread baking. She woke to sunlight filtering through thin curtains and the sound of a kettle whistling in the kitchen. The man, she later learned his name, was Samuel, though he never insisted on it, poured her coffee without speaking. He showed her how to add milk, how to butter the bread, how to sit at a table without fear. It was the strangest education she had ever received. The other women were housed in a converted bunkhouse nearby. They gathered each morning near the barn, where Samuel and 2 younger ranch hands, both too old for military service due to injuries, explained the work: picking cotton, feeding chickens, mending fences, hauling water. The tasks were hard but straightforward. No one shouted. No one carried weapons. When one woman stumbled and cut her hand on barbed wire, Samuel wrapped it himself, clumsy but careful, his brow furrowed in concentration. She watched his hands shake slightly as he tied the bandage. He was nervous. That realization hit her like a stone. He was afraid of hurting her. Days turned into weeks. The rhythm of the ranch became routine. Wake at dawn, work in the fields, eat lunch under the shade of the barn, return to the house at dusk. The food was simple but abundant: beans, cornbread, fried eggs, occasionally meat. After months of watery rice and rotting vegetables, it felt like luxury, but guilt gnawed at every meal. She thought of her mother, who was somewhere in Japan, possibly starving. She thought of her brother, who had died in the Philippines. She thought of the children in her village who had nothing. And here she sat, eating butter and bread baked by the enemy. One evening, the rancher's neighbor, a woman in her 50s with flour-dusted hands and kind eyes, arrived with a covered dish. She didn't speak Japanese. The nurse didn't speak much English. But the woman smiled, set the dish on the table, and lifted the lid. Peach pie. Golden crust, cinnamon sugar glaze, steam rising into the cool air. The nurse took a bite. Sweetness exploded on her tongue, so intense, so unexpected, that she laughed. A sharp, involuntary sound that escaped before she could stop it. She covered her mouth, eyes wide, but no one scolded her. Samuel just looked down, smiled faintly, and turned back to the stove. That night, lying beneath the quilt again, she whispered into the darkness, "Am I still a prisoner if I don't want to leave?" The letters arrived in late September. The Red Cross had arranged for POWs to send mail home, monitored but uncensored in content. The nurse sat at the small kitchen table with a pencil and a sheet of blank paper, staring at the whiteness for nearly an hour. What could she possibly say? How could she explain that her captor poured her coffee every morning? That she slept in his bed while he took the floor? That she had laughed over pie baked by the enemy's wife? She wrote carefully, choosing each word like a stone she might step on. "Mother, I am alive. I am not cold. Tell the family I am safe." She didn't mention the quilt. She didn't mention Samuel. She didn't mention that the nights here were quieter than any she had known in Japan, where air raid sirens and hunger had been constant companions. She folded the letter, sealed it, and handed it to the young corporal, who came to collect the mail. She didn't know if it would ever arrive. She didn't know if her mother was still alive to read it. But she had written it anyway, because the act itself meant something. It meant she still existed. Across the ranch, the other women were writing too. One described the smell of bread. Another described the rocking chair on the porch that creaked like an old song. A third wrote about the cowboy who had taught her to ride a horse, slowly, patiently, never once raising his voice. These letters were small rebellions. To say "I am treated well" was to defy every warning they had been given. To admit safety was to crack the foundation of everything they had believed about honor, duty, and the enemy. The responses when they came were devastating. One woman's family wrote back in barely legible script, "We have no rice. We boil weeds. Your brother is gone." Another received a letter from a cousin. "Everyone asks why you survived. No one understands." The nurse's own mother wrote only, "You must come home, but you are not the daughter who left." The guilt became suffocating. Some women began refusing meals, pushing plates away half-eaten. Others hid food beneath their mattresses, as if hoarding it could somehow send it across the ocean. One tried to mail a bundle of biscuits wrapped in cloth. It was returned gently, with a note explaining it couldn't be sent. The abundance here felt like theft. Every full plate was evidence of betrayal. The invisible war between belief and evidence raged inside each of them. One afternoon, the nurse sat alone at the table, staring at a bowl of stew gone cold. Her mother's letter lay beside it, unfolded. She hadn't realized she was crying until tears fell into the broth, blurring the surface. Samuel came in quietly, sat across from her, and waited. When she finally looked up, he said it plainly. "You deserve to be full." She shook her head, tried to explain about her mother, about the weeds, about the shame. He listened. Then he pushed the bowl back toward her, just slightly. "Eating don't make it worse. Starving here won't feed them there." It was unbearable, not because he was wrong, but because he was right, and because no officer, no teacher, no elder had ever told her she deserved anything at all. That night she ate, slowly, deliberately. Each bite felt like confession. Spring came to the ranch in March 1946. The war had been over for months, but repatriation was slow, tangled in bureaucracy and logistics. The nurse had been on the ranch for nearly 8 months. She knew the rhythm of the place now, the way the chickens clucked at dawn, the way the windmill creaked when storms approached, the way Samuel hummed softly while frying eggs. She had planted a small garden behind the barn, just a square of earth he had given her without explanation. Tomatoes, beans, a few wildflowers. She tended it every evening, kneeling in the dirt, hands deep in soil that had once felt foreign and now felt like her own. One evening, as the sun dipped low and fireflies blinked along the fence line, Samuel brought out a harmonica. He didn't play well. The notes stumbled, cracked, wandered off key. But he tried. One of the younger women, a seamstress before the war, began to hum along. A lullaby her mother used to sing. Samuel listened, nodding, then tried to match the melody. He failed, badly. The woman laughed, a bright, involuntary sound, and Samuel grinned, rubbing the back of his neck in mock defeat. For a moment they weren't prisoners and captors. They were just people fumbling toward something human in the dark. But the softness couldn't last. In April the orders came. Repatriation. All Japanese posts were to be returned to Japan by summer. The nurse stood in the kitchen, holding the official notice, and felt the floor tilt beneath her. Samuel stood in the doorway, hat in his hands, mouth tight. "It's time," he said quietly. She nodded. She had known this day would come. But knowing didn't make it easier. The boat docked in Yokohama on a gray morning in late May. The nurse stepped onto the pier with her small bundle of belongings, a scarf, a letter, a silver hairbrush the rancher's neighbor had given her. The city beyond the port was unrecognizable. Buildings leaned at broken angles. Roofs were gone. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to ash and rubble. The smell of rot and salt clung to everything. She walked for hours through streets she once knew by heart, searching for the house where she had grown up. When she found the place, there was nothing left. Just weeds and fragments of roof tile, half buried in dirt. Her mother had survived, but barely. Thinner than memory, older than time, their reunion was quiet. No long embrace, no tears, just a nod. Later the whispers began. She was captured. She lived with Americans, She looks well. Shame settled over her like a second skin. She stopped speaking of the ranch, of the garden, of the harmonica. When asked how she survived, she said only, "I was lucky." But memory is stubborn. At night she dreamed of wooden floors creaking under careful footsteps, of the smell of chili warming on the stove, of wind moving through open fields without the sound of sirens. She dreamed of a man placing a blanket on the floor without a word. She woke each time with her hand curled tight around the silver hairbrush, tracing the engraved edge with her thumb, grounding herself in the knowledge that those memories were real. Years passed. The city rebuilt itself in pieces. She found work. She married, though not for love. She learned to be quiet again. But the woman she had been on that ranch never left her. She appeared in small moments, when she chose mercy over obedience, when she spoke gently instead of harshly, when she refused to believe that suffering was the only proof of worth. She never forgot the man who had given her his bed. Not his face, not his voice, not the way he had said, "You deserve to be full." And in her quietest moments, when the world felt unbearably small again, she would close her eyes and remember this truth. Once, in the land of the enemy, she had been seen. Not as a prisoner, not as a symbol, but as a person. If you've made it this far, we want to hear from you. Was this story what you expected? Leave a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Your voice matters.